Good morning, everybody. Heli Kautonen is my name, and Pia Naukkarinen has been working on this topic and the paper with me, but I will be the one presenting it afterwards. If you have questions, especially concerning the case example I'm going to present, Pia is the person who will know more about the practical side. As it is, it's rather difficult to concentrate on the previous presentation while you are focusing on your own that is to come next, but I think, thank you, Chris, for the MIT vision. I think that our presentation, or this presentation, this talk is only a fraction of what you've been talking about. But I think that the common denominator, I'm really happy to have this our talk in this session talking about innovation, because what I think is common is to think big, not only the practical side, but to move forward. Now, a little bit practice this way. So we are going to talk about the challenges of restricted access materials. And so the challenges, the first part is about the challenges, then about the design approach, which we believe that will help us thinking big, and then a little bit about the case to show you an example what it means in practice. The fact is that we have to serve the present, as we, in this previous, we have to serve the present while inventing the future. And for in the context of open science, we really, the National Library of Finland, really, and actually all the university libraries and universities in Finland are highly committed to move to open science. And there are good policies made on local level and national level and international level. However, our developers and designers have these tasks on their desktop. They have to deal with different problems that are really practical. And at the same time, we should keep the questions, the policies, and the future in mind. So that is what this is about. We were planning to give you a take-home message, but actually there is not a single take-home message. At the end, I might put it together in a different way, but at this moment we thought that what we have as a motto for ourselves is this: progress is more important than perfection. And actually, 2 weeks ago, I attended a seminar in Oslo, the University Library of Oslo, talking about design, thinking, and user experience for libraries. And they had this wonderful motto that I'm going to taste a little bit more. Refinement is more important than novelty. And I think that this is also something good that we could think about when talking about these questions of present and future, matching them together. So it's also about incremental move. Yesterday, I attended a track on impact evaluation or impact of our work, and there was this discussion about it is good to make some, it is easy to make good solutions when you're developing an entirely new system or entirely new service. But what if you have to just work with what you have at your hand? And this is actually what is the reality for most of us. We have so many services and systems that need to be developed, and we cannot invest on new systems and services all the time. So the challenge, restricted access materials. Please give me a show of hands. Who of you have faced this issue of restricted access materials? Quite a many of you, most, I think. Open science is about providing public access to materials. Well, most of institutions, libraries and cultural heritage organizations hosting materials have still some material that cannot be displayed publicly. And there are legitimate reasons for this. But from the user's viewpoint, because we are serving this, we are building our services for users, this can be a tricky situation. We at the National Library have made quite many user studies, user surveys, trying to understand what users think and need. We've conducted a year ago, or a year and a half ago, a contextual study on researchers, particularly on researchers, and also some studies for students. And on these studies, we really we saw that this is what our customers think. They, particularly researchers, postdoc researchers, they know that their collections, they know their topic, they know the archives, for example, they know that there exists some material. But why can't they get their hands on it? Where is it hidden? And that is one of the questions. Then the other one is that when they finally get their hands on the material, what can they do with it? And how can they use them? How can they reuse the material? And the final question, particularly when we face them with, for example, Creative Commons licenses, they just get annoyed. Why can't I use this as I will? Why are there these restrictions? So this is something that we face every day. Then this is what is the reason behind. Now I'm moving on to the, well, I would like to quote here Galadriel from the Lord of the Rings. The world is changing. I can feel it in the water. I can feel it in the air. And one of the areas where there is a really big change is legislation. Because our world is changing, our legislation is changing. And since being in Finland, we deal mostly with our national laws, and, but also our European laws. It was interesting preparing for this presentation. I went through some laws also elsewhere in the world. I'm more familiar with the European Finnish law, but I went through the laws of United States and also our host country, Australia, to see if there are some similarities. And one of the similarities is that most of the laws binding our users are from 1960s, 70s, or 80s. There have been updates recently, but still the big change is to come. Particularly the technical changes, the change of technology will make us change the laws. And these laws, one of the most important ones that we are concentrating on this presentation, or the case example, is the laws dealing with data protection. And the most important for every European is the European Union General Data Protection Regulation, which binds all European countries, and actually globally, since our services are online, they bind also other service providers in some at some level. Then the design considerations coming from this legislation are how to give our users the required information, and also how to protect the sensitive data or the personal data. I will skip the next 4 slides they deal with other legislation dealing with users and their interests and restricting or putting boundaries on what we as hosts of material can do. And these deal with copyrights, and there are certain design considerations for copyrights as well. Most of us are very familiar with these already. We have been forced to implement these into our services at some level or another. And there are certain individual, for example, contractual constraints to our materials that we also have to deal with our practices. But to move on, to give some answers what to do, these are really, really complex challenges for us, since we do have our everyday work to do, and also the big ideas what we should be doing. And this is when the design approach comes in. There are several concepts for designers, designerly thinking. Most important for libraries and cultural heritage organization is to have adequate understanding when to involve design professionals into the work. And adequate understanding means that you have to have some kind of idea what the design profession is doing, what is the hot topic for the design professionals at the moment. Whether they are, whether you deal with interaction design or user experience design, the second from the bottom, or the recent speculative design. So for librarians, it's relevant to understand that, and also for developers and administrators, that design, in the mean I talk about design here, is user-oriented problem solving. Chris here mentioned that machines will be, you had a beautiful illustration of a robot reading book and wanting to have knowledge, but also from this perspective, also the machine learning and machine operations, the algorithms are for humans. So this is one of the first ingredient or principle of design approach. Design approach also, there might be design for the sake of design, but for libraries it's and for our society, it's important to understand that we are involving design into our operations because we have to be viable from the business perspective, and we have to be feasible also on the technical level. And that's good to bear in mind. And this is also for the open science policies. It's not design for the sake of design. The second principle of design is that it's always for the future. And in the context of open science, we do not want to continue the business as usual. We want to see the preferable futures. What I think is also important in this is not to look too closely. I think that in conferences like this, like Open Repositories, there are so many presentations of good solutions. Our peers, our colleagues in other institutions have made good solutions that we might too often just look at the solutions, not the big questions, and not look far enough. This is what I mentioned, think big, take a look to the future, far enough to the future, not just the immediate future. Looking to the future and discussing about the future this day is also about this change. I can feel it in the water. There is a lot of confusion and worry and anxiety not only on the social media, but if you look at any magazine, newspaper, and even research currently, for example, I'm more to the design area or the research on design disciplines, there is actually a worry. This speculative design is about that the world is so different now, but also, what happened? This one. Also, I've been interested to have a look at, for example, fashion magazines. That it is all about anxiety and worry and concern about the future. And this brings us to the third principle of design. It's always value-based, and it provides means for settling wicked problems. I will skip now, because I can see my watch, and I skip a little bit of this positive design approach. I'll just give you the idea that there are design approaches that tackle the idea of values. You can really take an approach that brings in the motivations of humans, not only the user experience on the level of your service, but also what you are really doing. And I move on to the fourth principle, which is turn it into practice. Acknowledge your people and users, acknowledge your target values, set your design framework and design principles, whether it's for profit or values or other values, and then continue with iterating the design activities. There are various guides showing you how to conduct the design process through iterations, and I think that mostly it's about understanding, exploring, and then materializing it. And now I move on to our case. How did we do it in the National Library of Finland? I present you the case Finna, which is the National Digital Library, joining together the materials from archives, libraries, and museums in Finland, including research repositories of university libraries. So, in practice, the design approach concerning the restricted access materials, who is the user? It's the researcher. What is the ultimate goal? It's the flourishing open science, thinking big and thinking to the future, despite restrictions, which is the law. And our design principles in this case, following the positive design approach, which takes into consideration the values, it's ease of access and use, rights and responsibilities, and then quality of the accessed data. And these are only taking into consideration the protection of personal data, not the copyright and other legislative law issues. And let me show you this practical example. I skipped one of these slides now. Ease of access and use in practice. This means that we should be able to show our users on the interface that there is restricted material, although we cannot even display the metadata because of its sensitive nature. It might reveal some information that relates to ethnic background or, for example, of health of the persons who are involved in the material. So we have conducted designs that or we've drawn designs that will make this happen. Then about rights and responsibilities, we also have to implement into the interface of Finna something that helps users understand their rights and their restrictions in relation to the data protection laws. And this should be as easy as possible. Then about the third, the quality of access data, this is still on the desktop of designers, because it's mostly the question that we have to elaborate with our data providers in the university libraries and archives and museums in Finland. So the current status is more like defining and ideating the big challenge. We are not yet close to the implementation or testing phase, but still I hope that this presentation gave you at least some ideas, and we really welcome your comments on what we've been doing and how this the challenge of restricted access material really should be considered in the spirit of open science. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heli. We have time for questions from the audience. If not, I have one. One of your latest slides showed an example of an interface where the user, when coming across a reference to something which is restricted, is encouraged very clearly to get a license, to get a license button. Can you talk a little bit more about what happens when what the design is when they press get a license?
The practice is, at least in archives, there is already this practice. Mostly this material, the restricted material, the one that is actually on Pia's desk, Pia is the designer for this, Pia's desktop is about archival material. And archives, for a long time, they have this restricted access material that can be provided for researchers. And until now, they've filled the physical blankets or the physical license agreements to use the material. Now with Finna, we include this process of getting the access to this material on the digital interface. Actually, we haven't been able to implement this yet, mostly because there are challenges of indexing the material and also challenges of the access or the restricted access services. So this is how we proceed. We think first of how it should be displayed to the user. So this is the user-oriented way forward. We think that it should look like this, and then we try to tackle the things under the behind the scenes. So, did this answer your question? Good.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? If not, well, thank you again, Heli, for your presentation.
Thank you.